Hello, great and bountiful YouTube empire. I'm your host Chiinferno, and welcome back to another time-lapse speed paint. I thought it might be a fun idea for this particular project to kind of walk you through my work process a bit, so I hope you enjoy. Starting out with the part of the piece I typically forget to film myself drawing, the thumbnail sketch. In my defense, this particular sketch happened to be one I set up in advance and in bulk, with several other sketches for future projects, and it wasn't until later that I decided this would be the one I'd use for the video. The thumbnail is basically a very rough sketch, or sometimes even a literal scribble, of the concept of what I'm wanting to draw. The idea in its most basic form. The key here is not to worry so much about how it looks or even how clearly the idea is being conveyed, but more so to focus on the basic shapes and the feeling you want to evoke in this piece. Sometimes I'll even include little notes of things I feel should be kept in mind. Now for this piece, I'm starting off by reducing the opacity of the initial sketch so I can draw over it with what will eventually be the next draft or the final version. I haven't started drawing just yet, but if you look in the bottom right corner you can see I'm meticulously setting up what will become my work environment so I can keep things organized. Admittedly, this is mostly something I did for the video. While I do generally try to stay well organized, I'm not usually so meticulous about it. Most of the time I set up these folders and label them, or not, as I go. And here's a little tip for burnout. If you're ever in a position where you've become exhausted, perhaps you're suffering from art block, or what often happens to me, you have plenty of ideas, but for whatever reason you can't seem to get them drawn. It happens to just about everyone. What I like to do when I feel the itch to work but can't seem to produce satisfactory results is set up a scribble page and draw a bunch of thumbnail sketches for my ideas. That way, even if I can't seem to get them done now, I'll have a basic concept and a template that I can go back to finish them later. Also might be good to help keep from forgetting ideas if you don't write them down in a list like I do. Now that I've set up my workflow, I'm finally ready to start sketching the line art. I'll speed things up a bit. The character I'm starting out with is named Django. He lives in a dystopian future where shadows have taken over. You'd think that alone would be enough to start on an epic journey, but his adventure doesn't really start until his best friends vanish, and Django has to find out what happened to them. This piece marks the first actual artwork I've drawn of Django since I recently updated his design. Initially, the character was one that came about in a dream I had, but I altered his design to be a little more mainstream all the way back around 2010. Since then, however, a lot of my views in regard to what I want my characters to represent have changed, and I've gone through a cultural awakening as an artist of color. So, when I redesigned Django, I reverted him back to being closer to how he appeared in my dream, partially to adhere to how his original design should have looked, but also in hopes of promoting more diversity in my stories and character designs. With Django playing a major role in how the future of the world will turn out, I felt it was particularly important to stay true to my original vision for the character. Here you're seeing a pretty common tactic among artists. Although it's something I admittedly find to be a hassle, it's undeniably a crucial skill to learn. If something looks off, even slightly, flip the canvas and oftentimes you'll find what the problem is. In this particular instance, I screwed up the angle of Django's eyes. I tried to use resizing tricks to fix them, but in the end I had to redo them manually. Now I'm starting to focus on working on Django's face to his body. I typically do line work in 3 or 4 separate segments: the head, the face, the body, typically including the legs, but sometimes if they're particularly complex I may separate the arms and legs into their own segment, and the clothing comes afterward. This piece was fun for me in that, given Django's size, figuring out how to handle the uncommon pose was fun for me. Typically, I feel like this sort of pose with a character as large as Django would have been more challenging, however, I found it to be a lot easier, in part due to the thumbnail sketch I made prior. But also, I was just kind of having what I like to refer to as a good art mojo day, where for whatever reason the line work just came pretty naturally. I might not know how to explain it or articulate how it's any different from the more normal drawing sessions, but hey, I'm not about to complain. Just know that it's not always easy to whip out line art like this. And if you're trying to draw yourself, don't get too frustrated if it doesn't turn out quite the way you'd like right from the get-go. Now I've set up a sort of secondary rough sketch of the outline of Django's body. It's slightly more detailed than the initial thumbnail, but not clean or detailed enough to be considered final. Sometimes it takes a couple of passes, so even after the thumbnail has been done, I still tend to make further, more refined sketches until I wind up with the final, cleaner version that I'm happy with. Something else I often like to play around with is line weight. Most often, I try to stick to using a 4 or 5 pixel brush, particularly for tighter details like the face, but when it comes to larger areas like the body, I tend to use a larger 10 pixel brush. That part isn't actually related to what I just said about utilizing line weight. It's just something I tend to do to help stabilize my line work when working in larger fields. If I feel the lines I've used are too thick, I can always go back in and trim them down later. Having a variable line weight can be helpful for making things feel heavier, deeper, and can also be used to simulate distance or depth of field. Usually it's a good idea to stick to having thicker lines on objects that are closer to the viewer and thinner lines for things that are farther away. You'll notice I tossed some swords into the piece. These are assets I made beforehand, so I wouldn't have to redraw these commonly used weapons over and over again. I'm in the process of modeling some 3D versions of these weapons, so I can hopefully utilize them at angles other than the flat camera-facing angle you see here. For now, I'm using these as placeholders. You'll be seeing them again very soon as I work on some more in-depth edits. For now, I'll speed things up again as I finish up the outline for the body. And would you look at that? It's already time for me to work on the clothes. Doing clothes tends to be a more fun and relaxing process, because now that the basic shape is finished, I don't have to worry too much about figuring out how to make the shape look right, and can instead focus on working with how the clothes will fall into place on the body. Since Django is such a big and soft character, there tends to be a lot of squishing and puffing at points where his clothes are more constricting, like the bands on his sleeves. Likewise, some of the finer details will be lost where the fabric is looser and flows outward. Now, I know what it looks like, but rest assured Django is wearing a full body jumpsuit under these pants. It'll make a bit more sense when we get to the coloring stage. I had a little bit of trouble trying to figure out how to handle the bottom of Django's pants. The material at the base is meant to be thicker than what would be ordinary, so I wanted to make sure it was clear by rounding out some of the edges and not necessarily closing off the opening at the same line that connects the edge of the pants. Okay, we're back with the swords again. This process wound up taking way longer than I had anticipated, but I decided I wasn't happy with the assets I was using. The first sword I intended to use, known as the Black Jade, was the nicely put together vector render of the sword Django was using, but I wasn't quite happy with the shape of it. It's hard to articulate it, but something always felt off. This was an issue I'd had while trying to use it in other pieces as well. Furthermore, I needed to update the design to better match the way the sword appeared in the time Django was actually using it. So I set up my references, picking out shots from each era the sword appears in so I could make 4 distinct versions that represented each stage of the sword's history. The next sword, known as Howling Fenris, was one I'd drawn a reusable reference for some time ago. However, with the reference having been drawn as a raster image, I wanted to upgrade it to a vector image. Plus, I had Frankensteined the handle onto it from a different, lower quality image of the sword, and the blade itself was slightly lopsided. Now that the swords are finished, it's time to work them into the piece. One of the tricks I like to use to easily erase objects I may want to adjust later, or multiple objects in a group at once, is masking. Masking is your best friend when it comes to non-destructive erasing. If you're not familiar with masking, the concept is pretty straightforward. Essentially, you create a little bonus layer that you can draw on to hide parts of an image. Once I figured out how masking works, I basically started using it religiously. And it's rare that I actually delete or erase things anymore, unless I really absolutely don't need it. Now with the line art finally finished for Django, it's time to get into the coloring stage. Luckily for me, this is the easy part, especially since I already have Django's colors pre-established, which means I can cheat a little bit and pull them directly from the concept piece I already made for Django. The way you color is really up to preference. Most people I know simply do what you'd expect and paint the colors on the canvas by hand. Something I've also been prone to do, but I'm always searching for shortcuts to make things a little more efficient. Back in the day, I used to rely very heavily on the pen tool. It's a little tedious, but it's precise and can quickly get the job done without unwanted white space and artifacts. Before that, I used to do things a bit more destructively by using the paint bucket tool directly in the line art, which at the time was made up of pencil lines on paper that I'd scanned in. It got the job done, but the result was rough and ugly with tons of artifacts that I'd have to fill in manually, and it was a major hassle. Later, I started using the lasso tool to select out areas I wanted to color. It functioned similarly to using the pen tool, but it was a lot faster and offered more freedom, if not a little less precise. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it wasn't until recently that I figured out how to expand and contract a selection. Now the easiest way for me to color and mask is by using the magic wand tool to select an area I want to color, and then I can expand or contract it by 2 pixels to make up for the small amount of artifacts that would ordinarily be left over. As you can see, this is the primary method I'm using on this piece. Since I have the line art on a separate layer from the color, I also don't have to worry about the line art itself getting in the way. Sometimes I still have to go back in and clean up some areas the wand tool couldn't quite reach, but this method is still significantly faster than other methods I've used in the past. Now it's time to work on the other character in this piece, a mysterious man known only as 23rds. After the disappearance of Django's friends, 23rds confronts Django, trying to warn him of his destiny to fight against the impending threat of the Shadow. Unfortunately, that's when the very scene I'm drawing now happens, and the pair find themselves suddenly in a fight for their lives against this very threat. Django manages to escape, but 23rds is taken, leaving Django alone to unravel the mystery of these shadowy disappearances. Drawing 23rds is a bit trickier because I hadn't gotten around to redesigning him prior to this piece, so the reference I was working off of was a very old version of the character, and one that I'd never colored as well. So much like how Django was on his own to figure out what happened to 23rds and his friends, I was on my own with little to no assistance from my past self to figure out how to handle 23rds' redesign. Otherwise, the process is much the same as with drawing Django, so I'll let it play a bit and then I'll be back for the next section. Thirds fights using a pair of chalk rams. I wound up using Illustrator again, taking a similar approach to designing them as I had with Django's sword. Although this time I'd be working more from scratch rather than with a pre-designed reference as I had with Django. I wound up sketching a rough concept in Photoshop, utilizing Photoshop symmetry tools. Then I traced over that initial sketch in Illustrator to make a more refined version. This new take on 23rd's chalk rams may or may not have been loosely inspired by a couple of classic Beyblades, with a dash of Tron thrown in for good measure. Now that the chalk rams are done, all I gotta do is implement them. Then I started adding some special swooshing effects. This is one of the first times I've tried to do an effect specifically like this one, so it was fun to work out how to get it done. I want it to at least somewhat resemble the original pencil drawn effect I did back when I drew the original version of this scene, but also mixed with a concept from one of my other stories which features the black jade before its blade had been forged. There's no color in the picture, but it's meant to have formed a sort of translucent blue blade reminiscent of the swooshing effect I made in the current piece. Now I'm drawing the shadows. Initially, I wasn't really sure how I wanted to handle making them look like they could be actual shadows while also giving them a distinct enough form that you could actually tell what's going on. In the end, I'm pretty happy with what I came up with. I was originally planning to keep them purely black, but I wound up adding a rim light effect to help keep the features distinct, and later I'd use ambient light to make them feel like they had more of a physical presence, but we'll get to that momentarily. Also, I'm just going to ignore the fact that that one major shadow in the middle being sliced in half by Django's sword is facing the wrong way, but it's fine. Once all the figures were finished, I had to make a background. I have to admit, this one's a little bit of a strange one, since the scene occurs in front of Django's house, so the characters are in a more suburban setting. Admittedly, I cheaped out a little bit on the background. By this point, I was beginning to suffer from a bit of burnout, and outside of knowing it was a suburban setting, I didn't have much of a vision for how the setting should look. So I got a picture I felt represented the scene well enough, and I made some filter edits to make it less photorealistic. Depending on what you need, this is a perfectly fine way to make a background, providing you take the photo yourself or ensure that you have the rights to use it. It's not my favorite method, and in many cases can leave a lot to be desired, but it's a tactic I've relied on in the past, and one that's even been used by other industry professionals. But there are better ways to make a detailed background, and in the future I'm hoping to have more of an opportunity to draw a more in-depth background like some of the ones I've done in the past. But for now, I think this one is passable. And finally, it's time to move on to the last stage, shading. Like with coloring, this is one I've used multiple methods for in the past. Starting out, before I learned how to properly utilize blending modes and shading styles, I attempted to hand paint a darker version of the base color over top of it. It got the job done, kinda, but it was pretty ugly. Later I started using the multiply blending mode to a much greater effect, but adding shadows and figuring out where they should land was always a frustrating challenge. After a while I gave up on shading entirely. That was until, through some experimentation, I discovered a new method. I began using a cell shading technique around the time I started using the pen tool, which allowed me to make stronger, less wavery lines. I paired the shading with gradients, which really improved the style. I'd stick to this method for several years, learning to master it before I made my next breakthrough. Up to this point, I had been adding shadows, meaning that I would take a flat image and draw in all the shadows where I thought they needed to be. But later, following a friend's suggestion, I tried subtracting the shadows. The method I'm using here, where instead of starting on a flat image, I fill the whole figure with shading and then carve out the areas where there should be light. For a time I mixed that method with gradients and Gaussian blurs as I made the shift from cell shading to soft shading. But now I've been using the smudge tool rather than Gaussian blur. It's a little more labor intensive, but it's also a lot less time consuming, and it gives things a more painterly vibe that I like a lot. Also, here's a tip that a lot of beginners tend to miss out on. I myself wasn't really aware of this until I learned it in art school, but don't shade with black or gray. It's not the worst art crime you can commit, and depending on the situation, it can be warranted. But in the real world, shadows are rarely pure black or gray. I typically use a blue by default, since a very faint bluish tint is a pretty common shadow color. The shadows can come in any color you want, so get creative, be vibrant in your art, and use all kinds of colors. These days I tend to stick to the pale blue I use for shading, but then I like to spruce it up by adding gradients and overlays in the Layer Styles menu. You can see in this piece I decided to go for a reddish to yellowish gradient, which I thought would mesh well with the theme and the character's clothing. Another method I've begun to work with recently is utilizing ambient light. Another common mistake that beginners make, myself included until very recently, is the classic shaded ball error. I'm sure you guys have seen it at some point in your life. Simple shading practice with a ball to show how it's shaded on the bottom and lit from the top. It's fine and dandy, but what it oftentimes gets wrong is not accounting for ambient light. You see, most objects are at least slightly reflective. Maybe not like a mirror, but enough so that it's going to at least vaguely reflect objects or even the floor around it. This reflection is often seen on an object as ambient light. So what I like to do is just add some bonus extra highlights on top of my existing shadows, typically choosing a color of the nearest object, and depending on how reflective the material is, make it just barely visible to give the effect of ambient light. It makes a huge difference in the realism of the piece. And finally, although I wasn't initially planning to, I went ahead and went a bit crazy adding in some ambient light to the shadow beings to give them some extra depth and further ground them in the scene. And there we have it. After 15 total hours and 23 minutes, the Fight the Shadows scene from Haven. I hope you enjoyed my commentary. Thank you for watching.